Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Megan Doherty, the director of the Museum of the White Mountains. As we gather today, we're all on Indigenous lands. Those of us at the Museum of the White Mountains are on Indokina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples. We're grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. For those of you on Zoom, we've put some links in the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous histories of your place at native-land.ca, as well as the Abenaki peoples of northern New England through the Musée des Abenaki in Quebec. This summer's exhibition of Baskets and Borders is part of our ongoing efforts to learn more about the continued Indigenous presence in our region. As we continue our series of events connected to the exhibit, we're joined tonight by Sarah Parrish, Associate Professor of Art and Design here at Plymouth State University. Our focus shifts from the raw materials needed to make traditional Indigenous baskets in the area to the role of research in an artist's practice, with particular attention paid to ethics and an awareness of cultural appropriation. So please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the Museum of the White Mountains for hosting me tonight, for everyone who's joining us either in person or on Zoom. And I'm excited to talk about Ed Rossbach's artwork today in conjunction with the present exhibition. I wanted to echo Megan's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Plymouth State University and the Museum of the White Mountains is located on Indokina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the Alnabak, or people who have stewarded Indokina throughout the generations. So the subject of my talk today is Ed Rossbach and looking at issues of culture and consumerism in his basketry. I came to Ed Rossbach's work through my dissertation research, and he is known for baskets like this one. He worked for 30 years as a Berkeley professor on the West Coast, making baskets that he deeply researched all the different traditions of global basket making and textile making, both past and present, and incorporated those into his publications, his scholarly publications, as well as baskets like this one. As you can see, he's known for pairing that deep anthropological research with more contemporary or local to him references such as Mickey Mouse, and Mickey Mouse being associated kind of with pop culture and media culture, as well as here making this out of synthetic raffia. So he's known for using not necessarily organic materials, but things that he would find as part of his throwaway society. So trash, garbage bags, plastic, cardboard containers, all of the detritus of his everyday life. So after that brief synopsis of this artist who was working kind of in the 60s through the 1990s, you might be wondering, okay, why are we looking at the Museum of the White Mountains, looking at an artist who's working on the West Coast? Even more urgently, one of the things that I love and admire so much about the present exhibition upstairs is that it's making space for Indigenous voices in museum spaces where those have historically been silenced, sidelined, or misrepresented. So why are we taking an hour to come together today to talk about a white male artist when kind of the mission of the show is to talk about voices that have been silenced or misrepresented? So it's actually precisely those types of issues that I want to dig into today. Indigenous or non-Indigenous Americans like Rossbach have used a Native culture or romantic notions about it that may be misrepresenting it in film, in art, like we're seeing, in literature. These references pervade our contemporary culture, but when does admiration slip into appropriation? Is there a way to teach or to treat Indigenous techniques, imagery, and materials respectfully and ethically when incorporating them into new works of art or scholarship? So ultimately, Rossbach's work doesn't offer answers to these questions because they are by nature unanswerable, and at the very least unanswerable by anyone other than the individuals whose culture is being appropriated. But he does provide, working in the 60s through the 90s, an interesting case study of someone who's grappling with issues of cultural appropriation before that term had even been coined. So looking at this pivotal moment in the development of cultural appropriation might help us better understand that phenomenon, which I will define as best anyone can later in the lecture. But help us better understand that phenomenon and help us maybe even work towards resolving some of the tensions that surround it. This isn't even the only connection between Rossbach's work and the exhibition upstairs of Baskets and Borers, the past, present, and future of Indigenous basketry in the White Mountains. I'd argue that there's so many themes, but at least 3 themes that intersect with Rossbach's practice. The first being Indigenous awareness, and an awareness of Indigenous basketry and respect for that. Nature in the present exhibition, thematized through the emerald ash borer and the havoc that it's wreaking on local ecosystems. And time in the terms of the past, present, and the future. It's very clear as you walk through the exhibition how those themes intersect and relate to the work on view. And Rossbach's art can shed some light on the intersection of those themes as well. In terms of nature, he's using these materials from his very consumer-driven throwaway culture, and kind of using those materials and positioning those materials as a way of making a statement about sustainability and the degradation of the environment and the lack of availability of materials in nature that had been used to make baskets in the past. In terms of indigeneity and Indigenous awareness, he's really researching Indigenous traditions from around the world, and in that way kind of paying homage to them and clearly coming from a place where he would like to respect those traditions, but at the same time limited by his own subject position and the kind of existing discourse on how those Indigenous cultures were treated both in scholarly culture and in popular cultures, and sometimes in problematic ways. And then the overarching theme of time, I'd argue that these acts of potential cultural appropriation, it's not just a simple act of theft, but there are complex motivations. They're driven by complex ideas about nature and time as it relates to perceptions of indigeneity. And so his very complex artwork can give us some insight into how cultural perceptions of those 3 themes kind of evolves at this pivotal moment in the 1970s. And that theme of time, one of the complexities of talking about time in relation to Indigenous culture is that oftentimes Rossbach and other mainstream presentations of Indigenous culture often present Indigenous culture as if it's in the past. And in so doing, they're locking Indigenous production into this past moment and not allowing it to evolve, and not recognizing the contemporary Indigenous production happening all around. But you only need to step upstairs to see that that's not the case, that Indigenous culture is evolving all of the time. And so when you are at an exhibition like Baskets and Borers, this exhibition is clearly seeking a more authentic understanding of Indigenous experience in resistance to some of those stereotypes. Upstairs, I also think we're seeing recognition of natural actors like the emerald ash borer and the ash trees themselves that don't speak for themselves. So it may seem like a bit of a tangent talking about Ed Rossbach, but through these themes of nature, culture, and time, we might have some more tools to understand the exhibition from our own located subject positions and histories. So now from our subject positions back to Rossbach's, Indigenous basketry brought him to art making in general. when he was stationed as part of the Army Signal Corps in Adak, Alaska in 1945. So there he would have become familiar with Aleutian baskets. Here's an Aleut basket from the Hood Museum, so in New Hampshire, in the upper right. And here he is stationed, and he started making his own baskets out of local grasses, and that got him rolling on basket making, textile making. He pursued that interest with graduate studies at Cranbrook Academy of Art, and then in 1949 came to his position, which he held for 30 years at Berkeley, California. But he wasn't alone in his interest in making art from fiber. And when I say fiber, I'm talking about filaments or thin strands, kind of like the sweetgrass that you see on the green wall at the front of the exhibition upstairs. Other fibers include thread, rope, string. There was a whole fiber art movement in the late 60s and 70s, both in the US and abroad and globally, actually. And artists like Sheila Hicks, Magdalena Abakinovich, Claire Zeisler created these really innovative forms out of fiber, things that were maybe sculptural, maybe abstract. One of the few things that this very diverse output of art had in common was that it was challenging the traditional perception that art made from fiber, textiles, thread, that it had to be utilitarian and that it had to serve a purpose and that it couldn't be shown in a fine art museum. They really shattered that perception with large scale, often abstract work made from fiber. So this is kind of a big feat to, at least initially, get their artwork accepted as fine art when for centuries in the history of Western art, fiber had been sidelined. So how did they do this? How could they accomplish this feat? Like so many innovations, they were standing on other people's shoulders to be able to do this. So one of the main sources of inspiration that all of these artists and others note is looking at non-Western or indigenous fiber traditions. So Ed Rossbach, certainly among them. Here you can see this massive twined basket made out of rolled newspaper. So really innovative and funky and sculptural, three-dimensional. But to do this is clearly, as you can see in an image from one of his own research publications, based on the twining technique here demonstrated by the Yurok of Northern California. So especially to make things that were very sculptural or abstract like this, if we think about textiles in the history of American or European art, it tends to be more needlepoint, quilting, tapestries, things that are flat. So a lot of South American, African types of working fiber, indigenous North American, were all ways of getting a more three-dimensional form like this basket. Or here, this is kind of Ziploc bags essentially plated using a similar plating technique to the image up at the right from the Cook Islands. So fiber artists came to this knowledge from a variety of different sources. Here are two of the artists that we saw their work illustrated a few slides ago. Sheila Hicks traveled to Morocco and to Mexico and elsewhere to collaborate and learn from, as well as teach local artists there. Ed Rossbach did a similar kind of informal field research as well. And then others who had a kind of bigger budget, like Claire Zeisler, collected non-Western and indigenous artwork. And you can see a kind of swoon-worthy view of her apartment in the lower image there. For Ed Rossbach, I'd argue his primary mode of learning about indigenous or non-Western basketry techniques is through academic research. So in his position at Berkeley, he had access to Anthropology Museum, the Lowy Museum of Anthropology, which is now the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology. There were elite anthropologists for him to consult when he had a question or wanted to learn something. and also just kind of library research and publishing his own articles and books. So here are 3 of his books: The New Basketry, The Nature of Basketry, and Baskets as Textile Art. So from 73, 74, and 86 respectively. His writings covered topics as diverse and far-ranging as European lace, Native American blankets and baskets, pre-Columbian Peruvian weavings, African icats, and Japanese shibori dyed fabrics. So really expansive. So when we think about these publications, he clearly is trying to honor and learn more about other traditions at a time when he could just as easily be drawing on the history of Western art if he had so chose. But we have to ask, what does he have the right to be researching these and kind of telling and representing the stories and techniques that he's discovering? I put that in quotes. Or is he kind of telling other people's stories, and is this not really his story to tell? So to answer some of those questions, cultural appropriation has become a buzzword now. It's not just a scholarly term, it's in the vernacular, but scholars have made efforts to try to define it, to try to better come to terms with it. Here's a series of a kind of brief bibliography if you're interested in learning more about cultural appropriation from a scholarly perspective. And all of these authors have made efforts to try to define cultural appropriation. One of them, Borrowed Power, Essays on Cultural Appropriation. Bruce Ziff and Pratima Rao define cultural appropriation as the taking from a culture that is not one's own of intellectual property, cultural expressions or artifacts, history, and ways of knowledge. So this is a pretty straightforward definition, but one of the challenges of defining cultural appropriation is these 2 component terms, which are equally slippery and vague and hard to define even on their own. How do you define culture? How do you define appropriation or taking? What are the different degrees of that? But all of the authors and most definitions of cultural appropriation do agree on one thing other than its lack of ability to be defined, which is that it's inherently relational, that there are kind of relationships involved, and often those relationships are presented as a simple binary or opposition. So there's a situation where an us is pitted against them, a self is pitted against an other, and that can be one of the reasons why cultural appropriation, but even talking about cultural appropriation can be really challenging. In some ways, that us versus them binary can be progressive in the sense that we're used to thinking of that binary as moving the opposite direction, as kind of the colonial oppressor as being kind of center, and then locating the victimized others with a capital O on the periphery. Here, that is reversed. And the people who are often doing the appropriating are situated as the kind of external other. But at the same time, that very making of a binary kind of pits people against each other and is fueled not only by negative stereotypes about indigenous or non-Western others with a capital O, but by equally one-dimensional stereotypes about white culture, as quote, to quote Root, who contributed to this volume, as quote, the dead shopping mall culture of our time. And I was kind of rereading that quote as I was just preparing my notes, and our shopping malls are also dead. So like the dead shopping mall culture is now even replaced by this even more mediated, removed Amazon ordering culture. And that's actually going to circle back and come into play a bit later when we look at Rossbach's work. But so she's saying that this dead shopping mall culture of our time is getting pitted against this romantic view of a rich, authentic, indigenous or non-Western set of cultures. And so she's saying that that act of creating a binary is one of the challenges that needs to be overcome with cultural appropriation. To quote her at length, she writes, "Native culture, or more properly, the bogus version of Native culture that existed in the white imagination," and she's talking here about Rossbach's moment kind of in the 60s and 70s, "came to stand for authenticity and redemption. Many of us," and I love that she's recognizing her complicity here in this, "appropriated the most superficial and hackneyed marks of this romance, beads, feathers, fringe, as a mean of displaying our opposition to our own cultural background and the flatness and hideous pastels of suburbia. Appropriation becomes the only escape, and it becomes impossible for whites to imagine standing side by side with Native people as equals." So to kind of paraphrase this, she's seeing that a lot of cultural appropriation in her time, kind of hippie culture that she was witnessing and participating in, and that we'll see as a hallmark of Rossbach's art, that this was fueled by good intentions of wanting to resist this homogenizing mainstream consumer culture that was making everyone the same, and this inheritance of colonialism that was incredibly oppressive. That cultural appropriation was for many people an attempt to get outside of that, but because cultural appropriation creates this binary between us versus them, there were only kind of two options for self-expression. So there wasn't a way for people who are coming from a white background to kind of stake a resistance against that background and what they thought it stood for, without turning to appropriation, because a binary only gives two options. So I think that we see some of this operating perhaps in Rossbach's work. So his scholarship is, again, a very well-intentioned effort to try to bring visibility to traditions that were not published on extensively in English, and to try to bring awareness and a real scientific level of respect to the subjects that he was talking about through his publications. But at the same time, he's kind of playing into some of the romances that exist in popular culture, as well as scholarly publications around the way that people had to that time talked about Indigenous culture. For example, on talking about this work and most of his works that he discusses, he doesn't use dates. He simply gives the location of a basket. There's no artist names. And so in one regard, that is kind of a symptom of the information that was available to him. Those things weren't often recorded when things, Indigenous production got put into a personal collection or an anthropological collection. But he is kind of perpetuating that in his format. And in works like The New Basketry, he has a section on kind of global traditions, either from the past or the present, that aren't given dates. And then those are sectioned in a different part of the volume than the new experimentation by contemporary artists. So once again, he's kind of pushing Indigenous production into this time that exists outside of history or potentially in the past. And that's even more evident with his use of the word pre-industrial. We've always had, again, that false dichotomy of the kind of us versus them that cultural appropriation creates, has led to the challenge of using terms like non-Western that aren't very clear or appropriate labels. So his label for traditions outside of his own was pre-industrial. And so that's problematic because when he uses that term, he is sometimes talking about European artwork or basketry or textile production, but it is often talking about non-Western or indigenous techniques. So he's talking about the technique, that it's a pre-industrial technique, but because those are so often associated with groups outside of his own history, he's effectively implying that those groups are pre-industrial, locking them into that romantic past and not really recognizing that rich evolution that we're seeing in Indigenous basket making upstairs. So I think one of the things that does make Rossbach really interesting, apart from some of the other writing of his time, is the way that he is self-aware that how he is approaching indigenous baskets is a construction, that it is a myth. So he writes, romantic notions about nature and the noble savage linger to enrich our conceptions of basketry and also to circumscribe them. Expectations of baskets have become defined in relation to nature and a simple way of life. Nature and basketry are linked together. So here, there's those three themes that I mentioned at the beginning: nature, time, and indigeneity get kind of wrapped up in this romantic myth that here he's recognizing as a cultural construction and as a myth, the trope of the noble savage. And he does say that this circumscribes baskets, it limits what we can think about baskets. But at the same time, I don't think most people would use the word enrich to talk about the egregious term, the noble savage, that would be enriching our discussion of baskets. So here, there's problematic approach to this trope, as well as an awareness of it and a slight attempt to overcome it. And so here, when he's talking about, on the last slide, when he's talking about how nature, basketry, and what he calls a simpler way of life get associated with indigenous culture and then pushed into the past, I was really struck walking through the exhibition that I think I'm curious about to what extent indigenous authors and makers may be kind of aware of this myth and kind of savvily deploying it as kind of a marketing strategy. Upstairs, a pamphlet said the Abenaki Indian Shop in Intervale is an annually sought out by many visitors, young and old, as a kind of step into the past. So I think, again, I don't know the motivations behind what was written here. I think there could, of course, be honoring their past and the traditions, but that step into the past, I think, is also playing into people like Rossbach, who held and couldn't quite let go, even when they had as much authentic knowledge as Rossbach did through his research. We're kind of clinging to this romantic notion of indigenous culture, even as it was being produced contemporaneously, as being kind of a step into the past. So I'm curious whether they're kind of self-consciously deploying this as a really smart marketing strategy and exhibiting some agency through that in the face of this stereotype. But these romantic views of indigenous basketry are foundational to Rossbach's production. The Fiber Game was an article in Craft Horizons, December 74, and this operates almost like an artist statement or a manifesto of his attitudes towards fiber. And it also inspired other artists. And I think it's important to note too, other artists like Hicks, Abaknovich, Zeisler, they were all reading his stuff too, right? So he wasn't just jumping on the trend of looking at non-Western or indigenous art. He was driving it through his writings and through writings like this one. And in it, he's looking at Navajo culture or Navajo string games. And so he writes in relation to these string games: from string games, no products result, kind of cat's cradle. No fishnets, no string bags, or macrame wall hangings. String figures are constructed of the simplest, most unpretentious materials. The figures are evanescent, transitory, and self-destructive. They get down to the basics. They connect to what is really happening in fiber. So here he's saying that it's more about process, that making is more about process, is about authenticity, handwork, a kind of different pace of life than contemporary culture. And so by looking at Navajo string games, as he calls them, for those ideals, we can see how a lot of the ideals that we hold about craft in general today, that it's therapeutic, that it is about the process and about the hand and the maker, that we may see these as kind of non-racially motivated, but they do have origins in perceptions about indigenous, or in this case, specifically Navajo textile traditions. So Rossbach's sentiments are echoed in many other discussions of craft from the era. One of them is through Samuel Johnson, the president of the Johnson Wax Company, so like Johnson and Johnson. So on the occasion of the opening of this exhibition, where you can see a full view here and Rossbach's work in the center, on the occasion of introducing this exhibition, which his company sponsored, toward the United States, a survey of contemporary craft, he writes, or spoke at the time. The works of artist craftsmen represent a healthy challenge to our disposable throwaway society. So this is kind of ironic because he's the guy making all the throwaway stuff. And in some ways, this exhibition and sponsoring this exhibition might have been his way of kind of doing some PR and damage control against that, as people were starting to get more aware of those environmental costs. But here, handcraft for him is an antidote to contemporary mainstream society that he's helping to create. It returns authenticity in an age of mass production, and handcraft also it prizes quality materials, which is also in contrast to what Johnson and Johnson was putting out in things like their containers. So as we saw with Deborah Root's quote, cultural appropriation, turning to other cultures for inspiration, was for many people in the 70s, and perhaps continues to be, one of the only options that is kind of visible for people to, that people can see to kind of counteract or resist that throwaway culture that Johnson is describing. So Rossbach, I think, provides his response to this in his artwork. We've looked at his scholarship, but what about his artwork? So here, this is the type of thing that he's known for. It looks, when you're just looking at it, I know it's tough to read the black and white image, but even still, it looks like a pretty basic textile, kind of a flat wall hanging. Maybe it's a bit more shimmery that spices it up. But when you look in very close, what he's actually constructed this of is plastic garbage bags that are wound and wrapped into fibers. Sometimes clear bags wrapped around twine. So there's these very meticulously crafted fibers that are then meticulously crafted into a hanging. But at its root, the raw material is something that's intended to be literal garbage, something that's supposed to be thrown away with the trash. So if Johnson's saying that kind of finely crafted baskets are out of sync with a throwaway society, he sees these as objects that would be in sync with that type of society. Because historically, or throughout his writing, Rossbach stresses that baskets have a very clear and concrete association to where they're made. He talks about how, quote, the work showed a regionalism that reflected the special conditions that inspired them, and, end quote. The relationship between the environment and the population, he argued, was so tight that sometimes people would even choose where to live based on the available basket materials. And in many of the baskets upstairs, you can see a really clear connection between the New England ash trees and then the raw material used to make the baskets. But as landscapes start to look a little bit more like this is an extreme example of Times Square, but as people's environments tend to be more built and urbanized, what is the raw material for baskets? The ash isn't available anymore. And how can you accurately express these times? Because, to give an anecdote, Rossbach had only purchased things like ash, patinus, grasses. He'd purchased them from the store. So that was his only frame of reference. So he thought, I need to be more authentic. I'm going to learn to grow these things. And as he started to set about that research, he's like, wait a minute, this actually isn't authentic at all, because that isn't my environment that I'm living in anymore. I'm living in this urban environment. So what would those raw materials, what would the equivalent be? Just as the ash speaks to the ash baskets, Abenaki and Dakina environment, what would speak to this built up American consumer culture? And so his response were things like the garbage bag, trash, or things like this. Here you can see cut up food packaging that's been reassembled using staples. And you can see the visual noise, the branding, the mascots, the text, this all has the same energy as his environment. So to do an extended analysis of just one vessel, Eskimo pie on a stick, and I want to acknowledge up front that that is not a politically correct term, and we'll unpack that a bit more as we go on. But in this vessel, we can see just that the ways that he's used the form of the basket and the references of the basket, this ancient form and technique, and one that's also inspired by indigenous basket making, but repurposed that form for his own contemporary context. So first of all, I know it's kind of hard to see, but do you see anything on here? Like, are you noticing any words or images or things that are jumping out?
Raisin bran.
Yeah, Raisin Bran. Yeah, the Raisin Bran sun. Yeah. The title kind of alerts us to that. Yeah, so we'll talk about all of those different references, the Raisin Bran, the son of the Raisin Bran, Eskimo pie on a stick, the ice cream bars. These cardboard here, this work comments on consumer culture in a couple of different layers. So the cardboard itself is kind of like the fibers that were historically used to create baskets, just like those were surrounding, they were easy to come by, they degraded very quickly. So too does cardboard do the same. Weekly cycles of putting it out with the trash, just like there are cycles of tree leaves falling, right? And I think he's really known for his humor, and he's really witty here when he writes fiber, so the fiber from the Raisin Bran, or Eskimo pie on a stick. Fibers and sticks are what have historically been used to make baskets, but now he's taking that fiber from these fake cardboard fibers. So I think he's really self-aware with what he's using here, and saying that our new environments, just like the ash is going away, our new environments are diminishing and changing the materials that get used for baskets. The vessel shape as well. We've talked about how baskets are really tied to local context, but they're also a symbol of movement, right? That you pack up your basket and you carry it somewhere, that it's in transit. So if we think about him working at the advent of globalization and the globalization of markets, the basket or the vessel is a very appropriate symbol of that movement, that it doesn't quite belong anywhere. And likewise, I think a lot of the references that we see on the basket, they could give us kind of a biography of his own life, right? I ate Raisin Bran, I brushed my teeth, there's a toothbrush package there, I had ice cream for dinner, right? So in some ways, this is kind of restoring that authenticity, like, hey, this is me. But at the same time, this could be anyone. Like, I had cereal for breakfast, I'll probably go home and eat some ice cream, right? So he's showing that all of our experiences kind of become the same and become more superficial. So he really has that ambivalent, two-sided take on contemporary culture. And just like the vessel moves globally, I was really struck when I found out that the emerald ash borer, one of the theories on how it came to the United States was through a box, right? That the emerald ash borer was in a wooden, like kind of in the wooden boxes that were used to ship things. So unbeknownst to Rossbach, the symbol of a vessel was an even more apt symbol or metaphor for globalization than he even could have anticipated. There's also something kind of witty going on with this idea of the vessel itself, that first, to carry things, people used baskets before mass-produced boxes were created, right? Then those baskets were replaced with boxes, like cereal boxes. So then he dismantles the cereal box to create a basket. So he's effectively taken the container and returning it to its original identity, kind of as a basket. And it's also kind of redundant to be taking a cereal box apart and then recreating something that is another cardboard container, right? You're making container into another container. And that absurdity, that extra expended effort, for me, I think is a kind of critique of consumer culture that humor is a way of critique. The other image that you located on this basket is the mascot for Nestle's Eskimo pie. And I looked up today, and in 2020 was when Nestle, they've been bought by some other people, but they discontinued the Eskimo pie and they called it Edie's pie, recognizing that Eskimo is a colonialist term that is not politically correct. So it's impossible to know Rossbach's intentions, whether he self-consciously put this there as a critique of this mascot and this really kind of, or not kind of, stereotype of an Indigenous Alaskan as looking childish, as a way of patronizing that culture, right? I think given all the other references to basket making on this vessel, and his knowledge firsthand from when he was stationed in the Aleutian Islands and his references and awareness of Aleut baskets that you see in the corner, I do think he would think, just like he thinks these other kinds of reversals of consumer culture versus authentic experience on this basket, just as he's putting forward those other witty reversals, I think here he is deploying this in a self-aware way of critiquing this stereotype that this rich basket making culture has been reduced to this American emblem of convenience culture that's being used to sell ice cream. So as we've seen in that example and this one as well, it's difficult to pin down that kind of difficulty of whether he's playing into stereotypes or trying to challenge them. That's characteristic of his artwork more broadly. So as we've seen tonight, engaging with Indigenous culture as an outsider is a challenging enterprise, that he was an early advocate for appreciating Indigenous baskets on their own terms through deep, accurate, and hands-on study in his books and his artwork, by juxtaposing Indigenous basket techniques with consumer imagery in baskets like Chief. He appropriates Indigenous culture by way of trying to critique his own consumer culture. However, the logic of this message relies on an assumed binary between Indigenous culture as outmoded, static, pure, authentic, in contrast to what Root called the dead shopping mall culture of American mainstream culture. So paradoxically, Rossbach's attempts to elevate Indigenous art and to celebrate it and to put it in contrast of what he saw as a very problematic mainstream white-dominated culture kind of backfire into patronizing Indigenous craft by posing it in opposition to one another. So even if Rossbach strove to be an ally, he here quite literally puts Indigenous culture into a box. So our close study of his art reveals that cultural appropriation is more than the simplistic clickbait or simplistic act of theft that a lot of clickbait discussions of cultural appropriation would put it or reduce it to. Sometimes Rossbach is directly appropriating Indigenous techniques and learning from them. Sometimes, or always, these appropriations are mediated through myths and romantic tropes pertaining to Indigenous culture. As we also saw, these attitudes towards cultural appropriation intersect with ever-changing ideas about time and the environment as they relate to perceptions of Indigenous culture. And each of us comes to these themes of culture, nature, and time in both Baskets and Borers and Rossbach's work from a different perspective. So I hope that thinking through these baskets today makes us all more aware of how our own positions and our backgrounds shape how we look at and learn from art like that on view upstairs, and the power dynamics that we exercise in looking and learning from it. So I welcome your questions, and I know they'll give me a lot to think about too.
So many connections in the ceramics community to,
yeah,
I mean, in discussions of craft, craft. I think I remember seeing that, the exhibit where he had the hanging.
The Objects USA.
Yes. Where did I see that? Anyways, that line of appropriation is something that I talk about all the time now in class. I didn't used to. And the idea of, as an example, classic project that's given across mediums and across Basketry, is to look at native cultures or classical cultures. And it was always kind of passed over, like, oh yeah, there's Korean vessels, great, like, look at the celadons there. There was never discussion of the makers, and I always remember feeling like, that's wrong, like, what do we know about those people? Like, no, it doesn't matter, this was all production wear, and it's like, yeah, but someone, where did they come from? So in some ways, I feel like I try to work around that. I still do that assignment, have them combine cultures, find the actual maker, and that's where the discussion comes back to the classroom. It's like, okay, now who made that? I don't know. It's like, exactly. So, and that's where the appropriation discussion really starts for a lot of students.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And since you bring it back to teaching too, I think one of the things that I see with our student population is like growing up in this region, a lot of them do see kind of hippie culture as like their heritage, right? And so you'll ask them, like, they may have something that's slightly appropriative in their work, and you kind of ask them about it and they're like, oh no, but that's my culture, my dad was a hippie, you know what I mean? But they're a couple of generations now removed from those initial acts where that Root's describing, where a lot of that hippie culture, the back to the land, the craftsmanship, the feathers and beads, as she calls it, like that was taken from indigenous references or romantic misperceptions of those references, right? So now our students are removed from that and they just see it as hippie culture. And so you kind of have to dig back into those histories.
And the other, I think, that was fascinating is that where I grew up, there was an Indian moccasin shop. Run by an Abenaki family who lived in Wells. It's right on the one, if you drive, it's still there. And it always felt like it was playing on its culture, and everyone knew the chief who ran the business, his kids after him, so that, and it was a place where everyone would visit. So they were trying to, in many ways, cash in, but because when you were in the shop, they were never wearing the moccasins, they were never, that was not happening. So,
Yeah.
what's that connection there? So, so I'm curious about the establishment is it documented upstairs? Oh, boy, I'm so excited to bring my glasses over here, it's gonna be so great.
Well, and I thought it was really interesting that you picked up on that, because I think, one of the other things is that they had a totem pole that was put up and would wear like a plains kind of, and I think if we sort of tie this back to, I guess it's a couple weeks ago now, Kelly Weiskup, who's a Native American Studies professor and English professor at Northwestern, came and talked about Joseph Laurent's dictionary. So Joseph Laurent was the person who sort of founded the Abenaki Indian shop in Intervale in 1884. And the same year he published this English Abenaki dictionary, and very directly sends a copy to the Smithsonian. Like, you're not going to collect my words, I'm going to collect my words, and here you may have a copy of them. And so, and was adamant about teaching his children English, and his daughter's copy is now, was one of the copies that the scholar talked about. And I think there was this really conscious, we know what you expect of our community, we know what our community is, and we're going to give you something that's maybe closer to what you expect. So I think picking up on that kind of step into the past was really great.
Yeah, and I think it's tourist art was a whole nother chapter that I wanted to spin off into, because he does he's searching for authenticity that he's pitting against superficial consumer culture, right? And so for him, when he's looking at tourist art, and the types of baskets that they would be selling at the shop referenced upstairs, or in Wells, he's that's not authentic, because he wants to see them as kind of frozen in this past time before there were tourists to make art for. But that is just as authentic of a response to their contemporary circumstances as, or an even more authentic response to their contemporary circumstances and social dynamics than if they were to just make baskets from the past. So, you know, the idea of like a basket woven like cell phone case or something, you know, like I think those objects are so fascinating because they are authentic, right? They're authentically responding to like market needs and how those are evolving, you know, they're not static in time.
Yeah, and so that tall basket in the case upstairs,
Mhm.
that's like red, it has the red dye weavers and the sort of natural weavers, was a knitting basket that the Abenaki basket makers developed in response to watching women on the train coming back and forth every summer, dropping their yarn everywhere. And so the idea is that those two rings on the side would go on your wrists. The top is the lid comes off so you can put your yarn in, pull your working yarn up through the center and just have it there so your yarn doesn't roll away, right? Which is like a modern
And I
problem.
just love like the back and forth too, because it's like the women were probably knitting because of their romantic ideals about like pre-industrial craft, right? Which were in turn inspired by the baskets, and then they're feeding that back to them through the basket. You know, it's just like there's so much back and forth. And so that's why I think like cultural appropriation, we talk about it as like a kind of one and done, like, oh, look at that celebrity appropriation or something. But there are so many like reversals and nuances that once you start getting into that mess, like that's, I think, what we need to do to start understanding it better.
Yeah, are there questions from folks on Zoom?
Thank you for zooming in.
There, his work obviously was, you know, 60s through the 90s, right?
Yeah.
You know, I think what he's done is really fascinating and how, you know, he's like very educated and interested in learning about these other cultures and his basket, you know, making, but then sort of turning on its head and, you know, doing it in its own environment in his own way and like with the political sort of, you know, like provocative message there. But do you think like, how would you imagine that he was sort of his thinking would evolve if you were doing this work today? I mean,
Oh, that's such a great question.
thinking of time.
Yeah, and thanks for like the great summary. I'm glad that my core themes came across. Yeah, well, I think that when towards the beginning, when I addressed you, like I think one of the you know, main best practices in like Indigenous studies today is to kind of like, if you're not from a certain culture, to step aside and let that someone, a representative from that culture, speak about their own story. So I think that maybe I would like to think that if he was working today, he would be doing more collaborations, that his new basketry, instead of separating the kind of Indigenous artwork and kind of positioning it as historical, that he intermingle that perhaps with the contemporary basket makers that he was showing in the new basketry. And I think this isn't what you asked exactly, but I think I faced a similar challenge of like, how do you do this type of work today when I came to my dissertation topic? Because I knew that the work that needed to be done was on non-Western and Indigenous traditions. I didn't want to just be like a white girl who's descended from the Mayflower on both sides, like talking about European art or American art, you know, but all of those stories, it didn't feel right for me to research those histories and then represent them as my scholarship. So talking about cultural appropriation was kind of my way of saying that like, this is maybe what I can ethically contribute to this discourse and how I can address these issues, but not in a way that's recognizing that like I have appropriated in the past, you know, and it's in some ways somewhat unavoidable because of the way that culture is so, you know, intermingled today, but kind of recognizing that heritage and coming from a more authentic place rather than taking someone else's voice.